Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host. You may know me from Warm Pages. Before we begin, tell me, do you prefer listening with candlelight, a soft lamp, or in the gentle glow of the screen? Share how you set the mood for your evenings. I truly enjoy reading your comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now settle in. Our story begins. Chapter 1. The Bitter Wind and the Bad Neighbour. The mist rolled in from the north like an uninvited guest, thick and damp and clinging to everything it touched. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the door of his Croft House police station in Lochdew, pronounced Loch-Dew by those who knew better, and watched the grey curtain descend across the village with a certain satisfaction. Bad weather meant fewer tourists, and fewer tourists meant fewer crimes, and fewer crimes meant more time for the important business of tending to his sheep. He was a tall, gangling man with hazel eyes that often held a dreamy expression, as if he were contemplating matters far more philosophical than the petty concerns of law enforcement. In truth, he was usually thinking about his dinner. Inside the kitchen, his dog Lugs, a mixture of every breed imaginable, with a decided preference for the uglier characteristics of each, was staring at his empty food bowl with an expression of martyred patience. Beside him, Sonsi, the domesticated wildcat who had adopted Hamish some years back, sat washing her face with studied indifference, though her amber eyes tracked Hamish's every movement. "Aye, you're both starving to death, I can see that," Hamish said, reaching for the bag of dog food. "Never mind that I fed you not 3 hours ago." The peace of the moment was interrupted by the sound of raised voices drifting up from the Lochdew Hotel. Hamish paused, listening. It was early afternoon, too early for the usual pub arguments fuelled by too much whisky and too little sense. He sighed, filled the bowls and reached for his peaked cap. The hotel bar was crowded for a weekday, and the atmosphere crackled with a tension that made Hamish immediately wary. The villagers were gathered in tight knots, their faces flushed with anger. At the centre of it all stood a man Hamish had never seen before, a stranger in an expensive wax jacket and gleaming leather boots that had never seen a day's honest work. "I don't care what you people think you're entitled to," the man was saying, his voice carrying the plummy tones of London's professional classes. "The old shepherd's path is a liability nightmare waiting to happen. When someone breaks their neck on those rocks, the lawsuits will bankrupt this entire village. I've been hired to conduct a proper safety assessment, and I can tell you right now it's going to be closed." "Closed?" Archie McLean, the local fisherman, surged forward, his weathered face purple with rage. "That path has been used by shepherds for 300 years. My grandfather walked that path and his grandfather before him." "Then your grandfather was a fool," the stranger said flatly, "and lucky he didn't kill himself. The path will be closed, and you'll find another route for your sheep. That's final." The room erupted. Hamish moved through the crowd with practised ease, his height allowing him to see over the heads of the angry villagers. Now, he said mildly, positioning himself between Archie and the stranger. "Let's all calm down a wee bit. I'm Police Constable Macbeth, and you are?" "Julian Vane," the man said, looking Hamish up and down with poorly concealed contempt. "Rural efficiency consultant. I've been retained by the Highland Council to assess the safety and legal implications of maintaining public access to various historical paths and routes. The old shepherd's path is first on my list." "I see," Hamish said, "and you've concluded it needs to be closed." "Not just closed," Vane said, warming to his theme. "I've also identified several instances of illegal grazing on council land. I'll be sending formal trespassing notices to at least a dozen crofters who've been taking advantage of lax enforcement for years. This village has been running like some sort of medieval commune, and it stops now." Before Hamish could respond, a soft voice cut through the angry murmuring. "Mr. Vane, perhaps you'd like to sit down and have a nice cup of tea? I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." Moira Stewart, the village primary school teacher, materialised at Vane's elbow with a gentle smile. She was a small, neatly dressed woman in her late 30s, with soft brown hair pulled back in a modest bun, and eyes that radiated kindness. The villagers adored her. Children stopped misbehaving when she so much as looked at them with mild disappointment. "There's no misunderstanding," Vane said, but his tone had softened slightly. "I'm simply doing my job." "Of course you are," Moira said soothingly. "But you've had a long journey, and the mist is dreadful today. Won't you at least let me get you something warm to drink? We can discuss this like civilized people." She moved through the crowd like oil on troubled waters, producing tea from somewhere, distributing it to the angry crofters, murmuring words of comfort and reason. Within minutes, the temperature in the room had dropped from boiling to merely simmering. Hamish watched her with admiration. The woman was a natural peacemaker. Vane, somewhat mollified by Moira's attention, accepted a cup of tea and retreated to a corner table to review his papers. The crowd began to disperse, though the muttering continued. Can he do this, Hamish?" Archie said in a low voice. "That path is our livelihood. Without it, we'd have to drive the sheep 5 miles around by the road. It would ruin us." "I'll look into it," Hamish promised. "There are processes for these things. Can he just shut down a historic right-of-way without proper consultation?" "Aye, well, you'd better look into it quick," Archie said darkly, "or someone might solve the problem in a more permanent fashion." Hamish gave him a sharp look, but Archie had already turned away, heading for the door with his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. Later that evening, as the mist thickened into proper darkness, Hamish sat in his kitchen with a cup of tea and a plate of shortbread. There was a knock at the door, and Moira Stewart appeared, carrying a basket covered with a checked cloth. "I thought you might like some fresh scones," she said, smiling. "You looked so cold this afternoon, and I know bachelors don't always take proper care of themselves." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Stewart," Hamish said, accepting the basket. The scones were still warm, and the smell of them made his stomach rumble. "You're a marvel, the way you handled that situation earlier." "Oh, I just tried to keep the peace," Moira said modestly. "Mr. Vane isn't a bad man, I'm sure. He's just doing his job, even if he's going about it in entirely the wrong way. Someone needs to help him understand Highland ways before he causes real trouble." "Aye," Hamish said, though privately he thought Julian Vane was exactly the sort of bad man who enjoyed wielding petty power over others. Let's hope he sees sense. But as he watched Moira walk back down the path, her small figure disappearing into the mist, Hamish felt a prickle of unease. The village was angry, and anger in a small Highland community could simmer for a long time before it boiled over. He just hoped it wouldn't boil over before he'd had a chance to sort things out properly. He had a horror of violence, and an even greater horror of the paperwork that came with it. Hamish finished his tea, shared a scone with Lugs and Zonsey, and went to bed hoping that tomorrow would bring calmer weather and cooler heads. It would bring neither. Chapter 2. A Grim Discovery at Dawn. The morning came reluctantly to Lochdu, dragging itself over the mountains like a tired sheep. Hamish was awakened at 5:30 by the insistent ringing of his telephone, a sound that filled him with immediate dread. Nothing good ever came from a phone call at that hour. He stumbled to the receiver, Lugs trailing behind him with his ears at half-mast, equally unimpressed by the early disturbance. "Macbeth," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Hamish, it's Dougie MacLeod." The shepherd's voice was tight with shock. "You better come up to the old shepherd's path, right now." "What's happened?" "There's a body. That London fellow, Vane." Hamish was suddenly very awake. "Don't touch anything, I'll be there in 10 minutes. He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, his mind already racing through the implications. A body on the old shepherd's path, and it had to be Julian Vane. The timing was too convenient to be accidental, coming so soon after yesterday's confrontation. The walk up to the path took him through the sleeping village and out onto the moorland beyond. The mist had lifted slightly, but the air was bitter cold, and his breath plumed white in the grey light. Dougie was waiting where the old stone marker jutted from the hillside, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. "I didn't touch him," Dougie said immediately. "Just checked for a pulse, but he's well gone. Been dead for hours, I'd say." Hamish knelt beside the body. Julian Vane lay sprawled face down on the rocky path, his expensive jacket torn and muddied. But it wasn't a fall that had killed him. Even in the dim light, Hamish could see the massive depression in the back of his skull, and beside the body, discarded as carelessly as a used tool, lay an antique cast-iron peat cutter, its edge dark with blood. He recognised it immediately. The thing had been part of a heritage display in the village library, a relic from the old days when peat had been the primary fuel for Highland homes. It was heavy as sin and about as subtle as a murder weapon. "You recognise this?" Hamish asked, pointing to the implement. "Aye," Dougie said. "It was in the library last I saw. Someone must have taken it." Hamish stood, surveying the scene with a growing sense of unease. The path here was treacherous, even in daylight, a narrow track that wound between rocky outcroppings and sudden drops. To navigate it at night without a torch would require intimate knowledge of every stone and turn. Whoever had brought Vane here, and whoever had killed him, knew this land as well as they knew their own cottage. "Did you see anyone else on your way up?" Hamish asked. "Not a soul, but I came up the western approach. If someone went down the eastern side, I wouldn't have seen them." Hamish took out his notebook and began sketching the scene. The body, the weapon, the placement of everything. He photographed what he could with his ancient camera, knowing that better equipment would arrive soon enough, but wanting his own record of how things looked before the official machinery ground into motion. He was just finishing when he heard the sound of an engine labouring up the track. A moment later, Dr. Brodie's battered Land Rover appeared, and followed shortly by a police vehicle from Strathbane. Hamish's heart sank as Detective Chief Inspector Blair heaved himself out of the car, his bulbous nose already red from the cold or the drink or both. Blair was a fat, belligerent man who had risen through the ranks more through bullying and political manoeuvring than through any actual detective work. He loathed Hamish with a passion that bordered on the obsessive, primarily because Hamish had a habit of solving cases that made Blair look incompetent, which, to be fair, he was. "Macbeth," Blair growled, advancing on the scene with the swagger of a man who considered himself very important indeed. "What have we got here?" "Murder," Hamish said simply. "Julian Vane, the rural efficiency consultant. Struck from behind with that old peat cutter. Been dead since sometime last night." "I'd estimate." "I'll be the judge of that," Blair said, though he made no move to examine the body himself. "Dr. Brodie, what's your opinion?" The doctor, a lean man with the permanently tired expression of someone who'd spent too many years dealing with Highland hypochondriacs, knelt beside Vane and conducted a brief examination. "Dead 8 to 12 hours, I'd say," Dr. Brodie said. "Single blow to the back of the head. Death would have been quick." "Right," Blair said, pulling out a notebook with a flourish. "So we're looking at some time between 6 and 10 last night. Macbeth, I'll need a list of everyone who had contact with the victim yesterday." "That would be half the village," Hamish said mildly. "He wasn't what you'd call popular." "Aye, well, unpopular victims make for easy cases," Blair said with satisfaction. "One of your locals finally snapped, did they? Can't say I'm surprised. These Highland types have violent tempers." Hamish bit back a sharp response. Blair's prejudices were well known, and arguing with him was as productive as teaching Latin to a sheep. More police arrived, along with the forensics team and a photographer. The scene became crowded with official bodies, all of them stamping their feet against the cold and looking generally miserable. Hamish stood to one side, watching them work and making his own notes. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Moira Stewart appeared at the edge of the scene, carrying a large thermos and a basket. "I thought you might all need some hot coffee," she said, her voice soft with concern. "And I've brought some rolls. It's dreadful about Mr. Vane. Simply dreadful." Blair, never one to turn down free food, accepted a cup gratefully. "Aye, it's a bad business, Mr. Stewart. You're the school teacher, aren't you?" "I am," Moira said. "I spoke with Mr. Vane yesterday, after that unfortunate scene at the hotel. He was a difficult man, but nobody deserves this." "Did he mention anyone in particular?" Blair asked, suddenly alert. "Anyone who'd threatened him?" "Well," Moira said reluctantly, "he did say that several of the crofters had been quite aggressive. He was planning to send out formal trespassing notices. He had a list." A list, Blair repeated, his eyes gleaming. Do you know who was on it? I believe Archie McLean was at the top, Moira said. Mr. Vane mentioned something about seizing Archie's harbour shed over an unpaid debt, and there was Dr. Brodie, though I'm not sure what that was about. And several others. I wrote them down for you. She produced a neatly folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to Blair. Hamish watched her, noting the efficiency with which she'd prepared the information, almost as if she'd anticipated the question. This is very helpful, Mrs. Stewart, Blair said, pocketing the list. Very helpful indeed. We'll need to interview all these people. Of course, Moira said, though I'm sure it must have been someone from outside the village. None of our people would do something like this. We'll see about that, Blair said darkly. As the morning wore on, Hamish found himself increasingly sidelined from the investigation. Blair had decided that this was a case that would make headlines, and he intended to claim all the glory for solving it, and he sent his men down to the village to begin interviewing suspects, and he made it quite clear that Hamish's participation was neither required nor desired. You just stick to your sheep, Macbeth, Blair said with a sneer. Leave the real police work to professionals. Hamish watched him waddle back down the path, already mentally drafting the press release that would paint him as a heroic detective bringing a killer to justice. But as Hamish took one last look at the scene before heading back himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The murder was too neat, too convenient. The weapon too obvious, the location too symbolic. Someone had wanted Julian Vane dead, certainly. But more than that, someone had wanted to make a statement. And in Hamish's experience, statements like that usually came with complications. He was halfway back to the village when he realised he had seen no footprints around the body except for Dougie's and his own. On the muddy path there should have been clear evidence of the killer's approach and departure, which meant the killer had been careful, very careful indeed. And that, Hamish thought grimly, was going to make things considerably more difficult. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. By mid-afternoon, Blair had set up what he grandly called his incident room in the back of the Lochdub Hotel, commandeering a storage area and filling it with whiteboards, maps, and an air of self-importance. Hamish, knowing that Blair would arrest the first convenient suspect regardless of actual guilt, decided that a parallel investigation was not merely advisable but essential. His first stop was the Curry sisters, Nessie and Jessie, who lived in a painfully neat cottage on the edge of the village and knew everything worth knowing about everyone. They were twins, though Nessie claimed to be older by 7 minutes, a fact she brought up with tiresome regularity. Jessie had the disconcerting habit of repeating the last few words of her sister's sentences, like a Greek chorus with a memory problem. "Hamish!" Nessie exclaimed as she opened the door. "We've been expecting you." "Expecting you?" Jessie echoed. "Have you now?" Hamish said, accepting the inevitable cup of tea and settling into their cramped parlour, where every surface was covered with crocheted doilies and photographs of the sisters in their younger days. "Well, naturally," Nessie said, pouring from a teapot that had a knitted cosy shaped like a cottage. "There's been a murder, and you're the policeman, though that awful Blair man has been stomping about asking impertinent questions." "Impertinent questions," Jessie agreed. "What sort of questions?" Hamish asked. "Oh, where were we last night? Did we see anything suspicious? Did we know that dreadful Vane man?" Nessie sniffed. "As if we'd be out gallivanting on the old shepherd's path in the dark at our age." "At our age," Jessie confirmed. "But you did see something," Hamish said shrewdly, recognising the gleam in Nessie's eye. The sisters loved being repositories of crucial information. "Well," Nessie said, drawing out the word with relish, "we may have noticed Mr. Vane arguing with a young man yesterday afternoon, down by the harbour." "By the harbour," Jessie added. "What did this young man look like?" 30-ish, maybe younger. Dark hair, expensive clothes but rumpled like he'd been travelling. City shoes, completely unsuitable for Highland weather. They were arguing something fierce. "Fierce," Jessie said with a vigorous nod. "Could you hear what they were saying?" "Snippets," Nessie admitted. "The young man said something about 'you owe me, and it's my inheritance.' Mr. Vane laughed at him. Not a nice laugh either. Not nice at all, Jessie said darkly. Hamish made a note. A relative, then, and one with a financial grievance. That was worth investigating, though it would require discretion. Blair would simply arrest the man on the spot and sort out the details later. You've been very helpful, Hamish said, finishing his tea, if you remember anything else. We'll call you straight away, Nessie promised. Straight away, Jessie confirmed. His next stop was less orthodox. Angus MacDonald lived in a tumble-down croft on the far side of the loch, surrounded by chickens and an aura of theatrical mysticism. Angus claimed to have the second sight, a claim Hamish privately regarded as complete rubbish. The old man was about as psychic as a fence post, but what Angus did have was an uncanny network of informants throughout the Highlands, and he heard things that never made it into official channels. I knew you'd be coming, Angus said as Hamish approached, which proved nothing since half the village had probably seen him walking this way. Did your crystal ball tell you that? Hamish asked dryly. Mock if you will, Hamish Macbeth, Angus said with dignity, but the spirits are restless. There's been a great wrong done, and the dead man's sins have come home to roost. His sins or someone else's? Angus tapped the side of his nose mysteriously. The London man was a blackmailer. I saw it in the tea leaves. You saw it in the tea leaves, Hamish repeated sceptically. Or you heard it from someone who actually knew. My cousin's nephew works at the land registry office in Inverness, Angus admitted, dropping the mystical act. He said this Vane fellow had been requesting old property records going back decades, specifically looking for irregularities, disputed boundaries, that sort of thing. Ammunition for his campaign to close the path? Perhaps. Or perhaps for something more profitable. Angus leaned forward. Think about it, Hamish. A man like that, with access to old secrets and old mistakes, he could make life very uncomfortable for certain people, especially people who might have, shall we say, bent the rules over the years. It made an ugly sort of sense. Highland property law was a tangled mess at the best of times, and many of the crofters held their land through arrangements that wouldn't bear close legal scrutiny. A man with detailed knowledge of those irregularities could wield considerable power. Who else knows about this? Hamish asked. Nobody I've told, Angus said. But I doubt I'm the only one who worked it out. Vane wasn't subtle. Hamish left Angus's croft deep in thought. A blackmailer made for a long list of potential victims, any one of whom might have decided that murder was preferable to exposure. His final stop of the afternoon was less planned. He found Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson lurking outside the hotel, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Jimmy was Blair's second-in-command, a decent enough detective when he wasn't being bullied into following Blair's incompetent lead. He was also partial to whiskey and amenable to persuasion. Rough day? Hamish asked sympathetically. You have no idea, Jimmy said. Blair's got it in his head that Archie McLean is our man. Found boot prints at the scene that match Archie's Wellingtons. Did he now? Hamish said neutrally. And what's Archie's motive supposed to be? Vane was threatening to seize his harbour shed over some old debt. Blair reckons that's enough for murder. It's barely enough for a harsh word, Hamish said. Half the village owed Vane money or had grievances with him. Boot prints aren't evidence of murder, they're evidence of walking. Try telling Blair that, Jimmy said gloomily. He's planning to make an arrest tomorrow, wants to get his face on the evening news. Hamish considered this. What does the autopsy say? Preliminary report came through an hour ago. Single blow struck from behind, considerable force but very precise. Whoever did it knew exactly where to hit. Jimmy glanced around, then lowered his voice. There's something else. No defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. It's like Vane just stood there and let someone bash his skull in. Maybe he didn't see it coming. Or maybe he knew his killer and didn't feel threatened. That's what I thought, Jimmy said. But Blair's not interested in subtleties. He wants a quick arrest and a lot of publicity. Hamish reached into his jacket and produced a flask. You look like you could use a wee dram. Jimmy's face brightened considerably. You're a gentleman, Hamish. They retreated to Hamish's Land Rover, and as the whiskey flowed, so did the information. By the time Jimmy headed back to face Blair's latest tirade, Hamish had learned several useful things. First, the forensics team had found traces of coloured chalk on the murder weapon's handle. though they hadn't yet identified its significance. Second, there were no fingerprints on the peat cutter, apart from some old ones that belonged to the library curator. Third, and most intriguingly, Vane's rental cottage had shown signs of a recent search, though nothing appeared to be missing. Someone had been looking for something. The question was what, and whether they'd found it. As darkness fell over Lochdew, Hamish sat in his kitchen making notes while Luggs snored at his feet, and Sonsi watched the window with feline intensity. The case was expanding rather than contracting, sprouting new complications like weeds in a garden. A blackmailer with enemies, a mysterious young relative, boot prints that proved nothing, coloured chalk on an antique murder weapon, a cottage that had been searched, and through it all, the image of Moira Stewart appearing at the murder scene with hot coffee and a convenient list of suspects, being helpful in a way that was almost too perfect. Hamish frowned at his notes. There was something there, some pattern he couldn't quite see. The pieces were all present, but they hadn't yet formed a picture. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and howling across the loch like a warning. Somewhere in Lochdew, a killer was sleeping soundly, confident that they'd gotten away with murder. Hamish intended to prove them wrong. But first, he needed more information, and that meant doing something he really didn't want to do. It meant breaking into Julian Vane's cottage. Chapter 4, The Blackmailer's Ledger. Breaking and entering was not, strictly speaking, part of Hamish's job description. In fact, it was explicitly against every regulation in the book. But Hamish had long ago learned that following every rule to the letter was a guaranteed way to let criminals escape justice while drowning in paperwork. Besides, he told himself as he approached Vane's rented cottage well after midnight, it wasn't really breaking in if you had a legitimate investigative purpose. It was more like enterprising police work. The cottage was a modern holiday let on the outskirts of the village, all double glazing and satellite dishes, the sort of place that tourists rented for a week, before complaining about the lack of mobile phone signal. Blair's men had already been through it once, which meant they'd probably missed anything important while confiscating Vane's laptop and mobile phone for forensic analysis. Hamish had a key, courtesy of Mrs. Mackenzie, who owned the property, and who trusted him implicitly. She'd handed it over without question when he'd mentioned needing to check something for the investigation, bless her. The cottage was cold and dark, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and stale coffee. Hamish clicked on his torch, keeping the beam low, and began a methodical search. The front room yielded nothing of interest beyond evidence that Vane had been a slob. Dirty dishes in the sink, clothes draped over furniture, newspapers scattered across the coffee table. The bedroom was more promising. Vane's suitcase lay open on the bed, expensive shirts and tailored trousers jumbled together carelessly. Hamish went through the pockets systematically, finding nothing but receipts and lint. But when he lifted the suitcase to check underneath, he heard a faint metallic clink. The false bottom was clever, but not clever enough. Hamish pried it up and found a small wall safe, the portable kind that businessmen used when they didn't trust hotel security. It was locked, naturally, but Hamish had learned a few useful skills over the years from criminals he'd arrested. Some of them had been surprisingly chatty after a few drams of whiskey. The lock yielded after 5 minutes of careful work. Inside the safe was a ledger bound in black leather and a stack of photographs and photocopied documents. Hamish spread them across the bed and began to read, his expression growing grimmer with each page. Angus had been right. Vane wasn't just a rural efficiency consultant. He was a predator who'd found a lucrative sideline in blackmail. The ledger was meticulous. Each entry detailed a different victim, their secret, and how much Vane had extracted from them. Archie McLean, whose harbour shed was built on land that technically belonged to the council, through a surveying error made 60 years ago. Dr. Brodie, who'd misdiagnosed a patient 20 years back, leading to complications that Vane had somehow unearthed. A crofter named Donald Mackay, whose grazing rights were based on a verbal agreement with a landowner who died without putting it in writing. And there were others. A dozen names, maybe more, each one representing someone whose life Vane could destroy with a phone call to the right authorities. But what caught Hamish's attention was the final entry, dated just 3 days ago. It was different from the others, more detailed and written with what seemed like vindictive pleasure. MS Ancestral claimed to Old Shepherd's Pathland, father's suicide following bankruptcy fraud, hidden artefacts removed from property to avoid seizure, perfect leverage, will enjoy watching the saint fall. MS Hamish frowned. Those initials could belong to several people in the village, but the reference to the Old Shepherd's Path was significant, and the mention of a father's suicide suggested something dark and personal. He photographed every page with his mobile phone, then carefully returned the ledger to the safe and locked it. Blair's team would find it eventually, but Hamish wanted his own copy of the information. Knowledge was power, and in this case it might also be protection for the innocent. He was just leaving the bedroom when he heard a sound from the front of the cottage. Footsteps on the gravel path, deliberate and unhurried. Hamish froze, his mind racing through options. The back door was visible from the front windows. The bedroom window was painted shut. That left hiding or confronting. He chose hiding, slipping into the wardrobe just as the front door opened. Through the slats he could see a figure enter the cottage, moving with confident familiarity. They went straight to the bedroom, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. In the dim light from the window, Hamish couldn't make out their face, but he could see their hands as they worked on the safe. They were wearing gloves, he noticed. Professional. Careful. The safe clicked open. The figure removed the ledger, flipped through it quickly, then replaced it and locked the safe again. They were about to leave when something made them pause. They turned, looking directly at the wardrobe. Hamish held his breath, every muscle tense. This could go badly wrong very quickly. Then a mobile phone buzzed, shattering the silence. The figure pulled it out, checked the screen, and hurried from the cottage without another glance at the wardrobe. Hamish waited a full 5 minutes before emerging, his heart hammering. That had been too close. Whoever that was, they were checking on the ledger, making sure it was still there, which meant they either didn't want it found or were monitoring who might be looking for it. He slipped out of the cottage and made his way back through the village, keeping to the shadows. The encounter had shaken him more than he cared to admit. This wasn't a simple crime of passion. Someone was playing a deeper game. The following morning brought an unwelcome development. Hamish was feeding his hens when Blair's car roared up to the police station, spraying gravel. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, heaving himself out with the grace of a beached whale. "I've got him! I've got the killer!" "Have you now?" Hamish said, scattering corn with studied nonchalance. "Archie McLean, the boot prints, the motive, the opportunity. He's got no alibi for the time of death. I'm making the arrest this morning, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." "What does Archie say?" "Claims he was in the pub all evening, but nobody can confirm it for the crucial hours. Convenient, eh?" Blair smirked. "This'll be front-page news. Detective Chief Inspector Blair cracks Highland murder case. I can see the headlines now." "You've checked his story thoroughly?" Hamish asked. "Don't need to. Evidence speaks for itself. Boot prints don't lie, Macbeth, unlike certain interfering constables who think they're too clever by half." Blair stomped back to his car, leaving Hamish standing in the yard with a handful of corn and a sinking feeling. Archie McLean was many things, most of them involving excessive drinking and elaborate schemes to avoid his formidable wife, but he wasn't a murderer, which meant the real killer was still out there, and now they'd think they were safe. Hamish went inside and called Archie, catching him before Blair's men arrived. "Don't resist arrest," Hamish said, "and don't say anything without a lawyer present. I'll sort this out. But I need time." "Time for what?" Archie asked, his voice shaking. "Time to catch the real killer," Hamish said. "Trust me." After he hung up, Hamish sat at his kitchen table and reviewed his photographs of the ledger. Somewhere in these pages was the answer. Vane had made enemies of half the village, but only one of them had killed him. And that person had made one crucial mistake. They'd left coloured chalk on the murder weapon. Hamish thought about the schools, the shops, the community centre. Who used coloured chalk regularly enough that traces of it would cling to their hands or clothes? The answer, when it came to him, seemed almost too obvious. But obvious or not, it was worth investigating, and he knew exactly where to start. He just hoped he wasn't too late. Chapter 5. Expanding the Suspect Pool. The arrest of Archie McLean created exactly the sort of uproar that Hamish had feared and Blair had hoped for. By noon, the village was in turmoil, with half the population gathered outside the Lockdube Hotel, demanding Archie's release and the other half closeted in their homes, nervously wondering if they'd be next. Hamish used the chaos to continue his own investigation, starting with a thorough examination of the village school. It was Saturday, so the building was locked and empty, but Mrs. Mackenzie had keys to everything in Lockdube and was happy to provide access to a constable investigating a murder. The school smelled of chalk dust, floor polish, and that peculiar aroma of children that never quite left educational institutions. Hamish made his way to Moira Stewart's classroom. He was noting the cheerful displays on the walls, the neat rows of small desks, the alphabet cards above the blackboard, and everywhere coloured chalk. Boxes of it in the supply cupboard, sticks of it in jars on Moira's desk, dust from it coating the ledge beneath the blackboard in rainbow layers. Hamish collected a sample, sealing it carefully in an evidence bag. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was suggestive. Very suggestive indeed. He was just leaving when he encountered Dr. Brodie hurrying up the street, his medical bag in hand. "Hamish," the doctor said, looking harried. "Have you heard? They've arrested Archie." "Aye, I heard." "It's ridiculous. Archie couldn't murder anyone. He gets queasy at the sight of blood. I once had to revive him when he cut his thumb gutting a fish." Dr. Brodie paused, then lowered his voice. "Or, between you and me, I'm worried Blair's going to start looking at others next." "Why would you be worried, Doctor?" Hamish asked mildly. The doctor's face flushed. "No reason. Just general concern for the village. We're all under suspicion, aren't we?" "Only those with something to hide," Hamish said, watching the doctor's reaction carefully. Dr. Brodie looked away. "Yes. Well, I'd best be going. House call to make." Hamish watched him hurry off, noting the nervous energy in his movements. The doctor was hiding something, that much was clear. Whether it was murder or merely the secret Vane had been using to blackmail him remained to be seen. His next encounter was less planned and considerably more interesting. He was walking back toward the police station when a sleek BMW pulled up beside him. London plates visible through the road grime. The driver was a young man, perhaps 35, with expensive clothes that looked slept in, and the harried expression of someone who'd been travelling for hours. "Excuse me," the man said, rolling down his window. "I'm looking for the police. There's been a murder, I understand." "You found the police," Hamish said. "I'm Constable Macbeth. And you are?" "Callum Vane. Julian was my uncle." The man's voice was tight with emotion that might have been grief or might have been something else entirely. "I just heard about it on the news. I came as soon as I could." "My condolences," Hamish said. "When did you last see your uncle?" 2 days ago. Here in Lochdu, actually. We had a bit of an argument." Callum grimaced. "He called me to say he was finally going to help me out of a financial jam, then laughed in my face when I arrived. Said he'd changed his mind, that I was a waste of the family name." "That must have made you angry." "Furious," Callum admitted, "but not murderous. Look, I know how this looks. Nephew shows up demanding money. Uncle ends up dead. But I didn't kill him. I drove straight back to Edinburgh after our argument. I can prove it." "Can you now?" Hamish said, interested despite himself. "Traffic cameras, petrol station receipts. My flatmate saw me return. I was nowhere near here when Julian died." Callum pulled out his wallet and extracted a handful of receipts. "Everything's time-stamped. I stopped for petrol in Inverness at 6:30, grabbed dinner at a service station near Perth at 9. I was home in Edinburgh by midnight." Hamish examined the receipts. If they were genuine, and if the timeline of death was accurate, Callum Vane had an alibi. A good one. "What was the financial jam?" Hamish asked. Callum hesitated, then sighed. "Gambling debts. Stupid, I know. I owe some very unpleasant people a substantial amount of money, and Uncle Julian was my last hope. He knew it too. He enjoyed dangling the prospect of help in front of me before snatching it away. Sounds like your uncle wasn't a pleasant man. He was a bastard, Callum said bluntly. But he was family, and whoever killed him needs to pay for it. Will you catch them? I intend to, Hamish said. After Callum drove off to find accommodation, Hamish returned to the police station and added the nephew to his growing list of suspects. Alibi or no alibi, their family members always warranted scrutiny. People had been known to fake receipts, and traffic cameras weren't infallible. The afternoon brought another complication in the form of DCI Blair, who appeared at Hamish's door looking triumphant. "Thought you'd want to know, Macbeth," he said with a nasty smile. "We found Vane's ledger, hidden in a safe in his cottage. Turns out our victim was blackmailing half the village, including your friend Archie McLean." "Is that so?" Hamish said, feigning surprise. "Aye, and it gets better. We found an entry about Dr. Brodie, something about a medical mistake that could cost him his licence. I'm bringing him in for questioning this afternoon." "On what grounds? Being blackmailed doesn't make someone a murderer." "It gives them motive," Blair said. "Motive, means, and opportunity. That's all I need. Between Archie and the doctor, I'll have this case wrapped up by Monday." "What about the mysterious young man the Curry sisters saw arguing with Vane?" Blair waved a dismissive hand. "That was the nephew, Callum Vane. Already checked him out. Rock-solid alibi. He was in Edinburgh when his uncle died." "You verified that personally?" "My sergeant did. Traffic cameras don't lie, Macbeth. Unlike witnesses who see what they want to see." After Blair left, Hamish sat down with his notes and tried to make sense of the expanding web of suspects. Archie McLean, with his boot prints and his blackmail motive, currently locked up in Strathbane. Dr. Brodie, nervous and secretive, facing the loss of his career if Vane's information became public. Callum Vane, just the disinherited nephew with gambling debts and a convenient alibi. And then there was the mysterious MS in the ledger, with their tale of ancestral land and a father's suicide. Hamish pulled out his photographs of the ledger pages and studied the entry again. The old shepherd's path, hidden artefacts, a bankruptcy fraud. These were specific details, not vague accusations. He needed to know who MS was and what their connection to the path really meant. The answer, he realised, lay in the village's history, and there was one person in Lochdoub who knew that history better than anyone: Moira Stewart. The irony wasn't lost on him. If his suspicions were correct, he'd be asking the killer to help him identify herself. But perhaps that was the point, was sometimes the best way to catch a criminal was to let them think they were cleverer than you. Hamish had built a career on being underestimated. He picked up the phone and dialed the schoolteacher's number. "Mrs. Stewart, it's Hamish Macbeth. I wonder if I might have a word with you about the history of the old shepherd's path. I think it might be relevant to the case." "Of course, Hamish," Moira's gentle voice came through the line. "I'm always happy to help. Would you like to come by this evening? I can make us some tea and we can look through the old records together." "That would be grand," Hamish said. 7:30. "Perfect. I'll see you then." Hamish hung up and stared at the phone, his mind racing. He was playing a dangerous game, but it was necessary. If Moira was innocent, she'd provide valuable historical information. If she was guilty, she might reveal herself through some small slip. Either way, by the end of the evening he'd have answers. He just hoped those answers didn't come with complications he wasn't prepared to handle. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. Hamish spent the hours before his meeting with Moira Stewart pursuing other leads, determined to eliminate the obvious suspects before focusing on the less obvious ones. His first priority was clearing Archie McLean, who was currently languishing in a Strathbane cell while his wife terrorised the police station staff with demands for his immediate release. The key, Hamish knew, was establishing where Archie had actually been during the crucial hours. The fisherman claimed he'd been hiding in the pub cellar, but nobody had seen him there, which meant either Archie was lying or he'd been very successful in his hiding. Hamish made his way to the hotel and found the landlord, a taciturn man named Willie Lamont who'd once worked for Hamish as a policeman, before deciding that cleaning and organising gave him more satisfaction than law enforcement. Willie's obsession with tidiness bordered on the pathological, which made him an unlikely ally in Hamish's current quest. "Willie," Hamish said, finding him polishing glasses behind the bar with manic intensity. "I need to ask you about Archie McLean." "That fool," Willie said, holding a glass up to the light and frowning at an invisible smudge. "If he's been leaving dirty boot prints in my cellar again, I'll have his guts for garters." "He's been in your cellar?" "Aye, he hides down there when his wife's on the warpath. Thinks I don't know, but I always find the evidence. Cigarette butts, empty crisp packets, the occasional beer bottle." Willie's face darkened. "The man's a menace to cleanliness. Was he there the night before last? The night Vane was killed?" Willie considered this, his brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, I went down to fetch a case of whiskey around 9:30, and nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard snoring from behind the old beer barrels. Thought we had a tramp, but it was just Archie sleeping it off." "You're certain about the time?" "Positive. The evening news had just finished, and I always fetch the whiskey during the sports roundup because I canny stand football." Hamish felt a surge of relief. 9:30 placed Archie in the cellar well within the window of death, and if he'd been asleep, drunk and snoring, he couldn't have climbed the old shepherd's path to commit murder. "Would you be willing to make a statement to that effect?" Hamish asked. Willie sniffed. "I suppose so, though I'll be having words with Archie about using my cellar as his personal refuge. There are standards to maintain." With Archie's alibi secured, Hamish turned his attention to Dr. Brodie. The doctor's nervous behaviour had been nagging at him, and the blackmail entry in Vane's ledger suggested a powerful motive. A medical mistake that could cost him his career was serious business, serious enough to kill over. Hamish decided on a direct approach. He drove to the doctor's house, a neat stone cottage on the edge of the village, and found Dr. Brodie in his garden, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Hamish," the doctor said, wiping his hands on his trousers, "I wondered when you'd come." "Did you now?" Hamish said, noting the nervous gesture. "Blair's sergeant was here earlier, asking about my whereabouts the night Vane died. I told him the truth, but I don't think he believed me." "And what was the truth?" "I was playing cards with Reverend Wellington until midnight. Poker, if you must know. The Reverend has a weakness for gambling, though he'd deny it publicly. We have a standing game every Thursday evening." "Can the Reverend confirm this?" "He already has. Told Blair's man that I was there from 8 until well past midnight, and that I won £12 off him, which he's still bitter about." Dr. Brodie managed a weak smile. "The Reverend doesn't lie, Hamish, even when it would be convenient." That was true enough. Reverend Wellington was many things, but dishonest wasn't one of them. If he said Dr. Brodie had been with him, then doctor. Brodie had an alibi. But that didn't explain the doctor's nervousness, or his behaviour earlier. "Doctor," Hamish said carefully, "is there something you want to tell me? Something that's weighing on your conscience?" Dr. Brodie looked away, his face working with some internal struggle. Finally he sighed. "If I tell you it's in confidence, as a patient, not a suspect." "I'll do my best," Hamish said, which was as much of a promise as he could honestly make. "Follow me." The doctor led him around to the back of the house, where a small shed stood among the rose bushes. He unlocked it and stepped inside, gesturing for Hamish to follow. Inside the shed, laid out on a workbench, were the remains of a large salmon, partially cleaned and wrapped in burlap. "Poached," Hamish said flatly. "From the Laird stream, Doctor." Brodie admitted miserably. "I know it's illegal, but it's tradition, Hamish. My father poached from that stream, and his father before him. The Laird's never there anyway, and the fish would just go to waste." "And the night Vane died?" "I'd caught the salmon that afternoon and hidden it in the stream to keep it fresh. After cards with the Reverend, I went to retrieve it, but I got nervous when I saw lights near the old shepherd's path. Police torches, I thought, though it must have been your lot finding the body. I panicked and buried the salmon instead, thinking I'd collect it later." Dr. Brodie looked thoroughly ashamed. "When you saw me last night, I was digging it back up. I couldn't leave it to rot. And my wife would kill me if she found out I'd been poaching again." Hamish studied the doctor's face and saw only embarrassment and guilt, not the cold calculation of a murderer. Besides, the timeline didn't work. If Dr. Brodie had been with Reverend Wellington until midnight, and the body had been found at dawn, the murder must have occurred earlier in the evening. "You're a fool, Doctor," Hamish said mildly, "but not a killer. You're not going to arrest me. For a salmon? The paperwork alone would be more punishment than the crime warrants." Hamish shook his head. "But you'll need to find a different hobby. If the laird ever catches you, he'll not be as understanding as I am." "Bless you, Hamish," Dr. Brodie said fervently. "I owe you a debt." "Aye, well, you can pay it by keeping your eyes and ears open. Someone in this village killed Vane, and they're letting Archie take the blame. If you hear anything at all, you come to me." "I will," the doctor promised. Hamish left the cottage feeling both relieved and frustrated. He'd cleared 2 suspects, which was progress, but it left him with fewer obvious answers and more difficult questions. He drove back through the village as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the loch in shades of gold and crimson. Loch Dubh looked peaceful in the evening light, a postcard image of Highland tranquillity. But beneath that peaceful surface, someone was hiding a terrible secret. He parked outside his police station and went inside to feed Lugs and Sonsie before his meeting with Moira. The animals sensed his tension and stayed close, Lugs pressing against his leg while Sonsie watched him with unblinking amber eyes. "Aye, you're right to be worried," Hamish told them. "This evening could go very wrong indeed." At precisely 7:30, he walked to Moira Stewart's cottage, a small but immaculately kept house near the school. Lights glowed warmly in the windows, and he could smell fresh baking on the air. Moira answered his knock with her customary gentle smile, ushering him into a parlour that was the epitome of respectable femininity. Lace doilies, china figurines, watercolour landscapes on the walls. "I've made tea," she said, gesturing to a tray laden with cups and a plate of shortbread. "And I've pulled out all the historical documents about the old shepherd's path. I thought they might be useful." "That's very kind of you," Hamish said, settling into an overstuffed armchair and accepting a cup of tea. Moira sat across from him, her hands folded primly in her lap, her expression one of sympathetic concern. "This business with poor Archie is dreadful," she said. "He couldn't possibly have killed anyone. I do hope you can sort it out, Hamish." "I intend to," Hamish said, "which is why I need to understand the history of that path. It seems to be at the centre of everything." "Yes," Moira said softly. "Yes, I suppose it is." And there in her eyes Hamish saw something flicker, something that looked very much like satisfaction. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. Moira rose gracefully and retrieved a stack of leather-bound ledgers from a bookshelf, placing them on the low table between them. The books were old, their pages yellowed and brittle, filled with spidery handwriting that spoke of centuries past. "These are the original land registry records," she said, running her fingers along the spines with what seemed like reverence. "Dating back to the 1700s. The old shepherd's path has been in continuous use since at least 1720, though there are references suggesting it's even older." Hamish leaned forward, genuinely interested despite his suspicions. "Who owned the land originally?" "Several families held portions of it over the years. The MacDonalds, the Frasers, even a branch of Clan Mackay." Moira opened one of the ledgers, revealing a hand-drawn map of the area. But the larger section, including the portion where Mr. Vane was found, belonged to the Stewart family. "Stewart," Hamish repeated, watching her face carefully. "Any relation to you?" "Distantly," Moira said without hesitation. "Stewart is a common enough name in the Highlands. Half the village probably has some connection to one branch or another." It was smoothly done, Hamish thought. Neither a lie nor the whole truth. "What happened to the Stewart land?" he asked. "Sold off in pieces during the clearances, mostly. Some was lost to bankruptcy. The usual Highland story, I'm afraid. Families losing their heritage to debt and English landlords." There was no particular emotion in her voice, but something in the set of her shoulders suggested old wounds. They talked for another hour, Moira providing a wealth of historical detail about the path, the families who'd used it, the disputes and agreements that had shaped its legal status over the centuries. She was knowledgeable and helpful, exactly as she'd been throughout the investigation. Too helpful, perhaps, too perfectly positioned to provide exactly the information needed at exactly the right moment. When Hamish finally left, thanking her for her time and the excellent shortbread, he felt more certain than ever that Moira Stewart was hiding something significant. But certainty wasn't proof, and without proof, he had nothing. The following morning brought a breakthrough, though not in the direction Hamish had expected. He was reviewing his notes over breakfast when Jimmy Anderson called, sounding excited. "Hamish, we've verified Callum Vane's alibi," Jimmy said. "The traffic cameras confirm his car heading south toward Edinburgh at exactly the times he claimed. Plus, his flatmate swears he was home by midnight, and the building's security footage backs it up. So he's definitely out of it. Unless he's mastered the art of being in two places at once. Aye. Blair's not happy about it. He was hoping for an easy alternative to Archie. What about the other suspects? Dr. Brodie's alibi checks out. The Reverend confirmed every detail, even showed us his poker ledger where he'd noted losing money to the doctor that night. And before you ask, we confirm with 3 different people that the Reverend's poker nights always run from 8 until at least midnight. He's nothing if not consistent in his small vices." Hamish thanked Jimmy and hung up, his mind working through the implications. With Archie, Dr. Brodie and Callum Vane all eliminated, the pool of suspects had narrowed considerably, which should have made the investigation easier, but instead it made everything more complicated. Because if none of the obvious suspects had killed Vane, then whoever did was very good at hiding in plain sight. He spent the morning checking and rechecking alibis, talking to villagers, piecing together the movements of everyone who'd had contact with Vane. The timeline that emerged was frustratingly detailed. Archie McLean had been seen entering the hotel at 6 o'clock, visibly drunk, and according to Willie's testimony, had been snoring in the cellar by 9:30. Dr. Brodie had been at his card game from 8 until midnight, with Reverend Wellington and 2 other players all confirming his presence. Callum Vane had left Lochdoub in a fury at 4:30, stopping for petrol in Inverness at 6:30, dinner at 9 and arriving home in Edinburgh by midnight. Which meant the murder had occurred sometime between, say, 7 and 9 in the evening, when the path would have been dark but not yet pitch black, and when most of the village had been occupied with their evening routines. The killer had chosen their moment carefully. Hamish walked to the old shepherd's path once more, retracing the route from the village to the stone marker where Vane's body had been found. Even in daylight it was treacherous going, the path narrow and rocky, with sudden drops that could prove fatal to the unwary. To navigate it at dusk or in darkness would require intimate knowledge of every twist and turn, not just passing familiarity, but the kind of deep understanding that came from years of regular use. He stood at the murder site, looking back toward the village. From here the lights of Lochdoub were visible as tiny pinpricks in the distance. Someone standing here could have watched the village waiting for the right moment, planning, calculating, patient. His mobile phone rang, startling him. It was Blair, and he sounded apoplectic. "Macbeth. We've had to release Archie McLean. His alibi's solid, and even I can't arrest a man for being drunk in a cellar, but this makes me look incompetent." "Well," Hamish began. "Don't you dare finish that sentence," Blair snarled. "I want this case solved, and I want it solved now. Get me a suspect with actual evidence, not just bootprints and blackmail motives." He hung up before Hamish could respond. Hamish made his way back to the village, his thoughts churning. He was missing something, some crucial piece that would make everything else fall into place. The coloured chalk, the ledger entry for MS, the careful planning of the murder, they all pointed somewhere, but he couldn't quite see where. He was passing the school when inspiration struck. The coloured chalk hadn't just been on the murder weapon, it had been a specific type, visible even in trace amounts, which meant it was likely the kind used for blackboards, not the dustless modern variety. The school used traditional chalk for its old-fashioned blackboards, a point of pride for Moira, who believed in maintaining traditional teaching methods. But did anyone else in the village use it regularly? Hamish spent the afternoon making discreet inquiries. The hotel didn't use chalk, neither did the community centre, which had switched to whiteboards years ago. The pub had a chalkboard for the daily specials, but they used liquid chalk markers, not traditional sticks. The only place in Lochdoub that still used coloured chalk in quantity was the school, and the only person who handled it daily was Moira Stewart. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was another piece of the puzzle, and the picture forming was increasingly clear. Hamish returned to his police station and pulled out the photographs he'd taken of Vane's ledger. He studied the entry for MS again, paying particular attention to the details. Ancestral claim, father's suicide, bankruptcy fraud, hidden artefacts. If MS was indeed Moira Stewart, then these weren't just blackmail material. They were personal history, even the kind of tragedy that could warp a person's entire life. He needed to know more about Moira's past, her family history, her connection to the Old Shepherd's Pathland. But asking her directly would tip his hand. What he needed was someone with access to old records, someone who trafficked in gossip and history in equal measure. What he needed was Angus MacDonald. Hamish set off for the old seer's cottage as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in Lochdoub, a killer was going about their daily routine, confident that they'd committed the perfect crime. But perfection, Hamish had learned over the years, was an illusion. Everyone made mistakes. Everyone left traces. The trick was knowing where to look, and Hamish was beginning to see exactly where the traces led. Chapter 8. The School Teacher's Flaw. Angus MacDonald was feeding his chickens when Hamish arrived, scattering grain with the air of a high priest performing a sacred ritual. He looked up at Hamish's approach and nodded as if he'd been expecting him. "The spirits told me you'd be coming," Angus said. "Did they now?" Hamish said. "Or did you see me walking up the path?" "Ah, you've no romance in your soul, Hamish Macbeth." Angus tossed the last of the grain to his grateful hens and gestured toward his cottage. "Come in then. I suppose you'll be wanting information about the Stewart family." Hamish stopped in his tracks. "How did you know that?" "Because you're investigating a murder connected to the Old Shepherd's Path, and the Stewarts owned most of that land until 40 years ago. It doesn't take second sight to make that connection, just common sense." Angus's eyes twinkled, though I'll admit the spirits did mention something about a school teacher and a long-buried tragedy. Inside, Angus's cottage was cluttered with the detritus of decades. Books, newspapers, odd bits of machinery and jars filled with things Hamish preferred not to identify. The old man cleared a space at his table and pulled out a battered photo album. "The Stewarts were an old family," Angus said, turning pages carefully. "Held land here since before Culloden. Good people mostly. Proud, perhaps, but honest." "Mostly?" Hamish prompted. "Aye, well, there was one tragedy. Robert Stewart and his wife Margaret. They had a daughter, wee thing, born in the late 70s. Robert owned a considerable amount of land, including the portion where the Old Shepherd's Path runs." Angus found the photograph he was looking for and tapped it with a gnarled finger. It showed a young couple standing in front of a stone cottage, the woman holding a baby. The man was tall and serious-looking, the woman small and dark-haired. "What happened to them?" Hamish asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Bankruptcy, or so the story goes. Back in the mid-80s, Robert got involved in a business deal with an English property developer. Fellow named Vane, oddly enough. Gerald Vane, Julian's father." Hamish felt the pieces clicking into place with an almost audible snap. "The elder Vane convinced Robert to invest everything in a development scheme," Angus continued. "Hotels, holiday cottages, the whole modern nonsense. Promised him he'd triple his money. Instead, the whole thing collapsed. Turned out the Vane fellow had been cooking the books, siphoning money out for his own projects. Let me guess," Hamish said. "Robert lost everything. Everything and more. Had to sell the land to cover debts. Lost the cottage, the farm, generations of family history. It broke him." Angus's voice grew sombre. Found him hanging in his barn 6 months later. Suicide, the official verdict said. Left his widow with nothing but debts and a young daughter to raise. What happened to the wife and child? Margaret moved away, took the girl with her. I heard she went to Glasgow, tried to start fresh. Died of cancer 10 years later, poor woman. As for the daughter, Angus closed the album slowly. I lost track. Could be anywhere by now. Could be right here in Loch Dhu, Hamish said quietly. Angus met his eyes. Aye, could be. Under a different name, perhaps, waiting all these years for revenge. Did you know Julian Vane was Gerald's son? Not until after he was dead and the papers mentioned it. But someone else might have known. Someone who'd been watching and waiting for the right moment. Hamish thanked Angus and walked back through the gathering dusk, his mind racing. If Moira Stewart was Robert Stewart's daughter, she'd have been barely 10 years old when her father killed himself. Old enough to understand, young enough for the trauma to shape her entire life. She'd come back to Loch Dhu as an adult, hidden in plain sight with her unmarried name, waiting, teaching the children of the village that had once been her home. And when Julian Vane appeared, threatening to expose whatever secrets she'd been keeping, why, she'd struck. But Hamish needed proof, not just theory, and he needed it before Blair arrested someone else or the real evidence was lost. He went home and pulled out all the material Moira had provided to DCI Blair. The list of suspects, neatly typed. The timeline of Vane's movements, meticulously detailed. The historical documents about the path. And there, in the timeline, he found it. A tiny discrepancy that he'd missed on first reading. Moira had noted that Vane had spent the afternoon of his death researching property deeds at the council office in Strathbane, specifically looking at a document from 1823 regarding disputed grazing rights. But Hamish knew, from his conversation with Moira herself just yesterday, that the 1823 document had been destroyed in a fire at the old council building in 1967. She'd mentioned it while showing him the ledgers, lamenting the loss of such important historical records. So how had Vane been researching a document that no longer existed? The answer was simple. He hadn't. Moira had fabricated that detail, probably to pad out the timeline and make it look more complete. A tiny mistake, the kind anyone might make when constructing a careful lie. But it was enough to prove she'd been manipulating the investigation from the start. Hamish made one more trip that evening, this time to the murder scene. He'd been over it before, but this time he knew what he was looking for. He brought a powerful torch and examined every inch of the area around the stone marker. And there, caught on a small outcropping of rock about 10 feet from where the body had been found, he discovered a scrap of fabric. Blue cotton, the kind used for summer dresses. It was small, barely noticeable, and the crime scene team had missed it in their initial search. Hamish bagged it carefully. Blue cotton meant nothing by itself, but if he could match it to something in Moira's wardrobe, it would be physical evidence placing her at the scene. The final piece came the next morning, delivered to his door by Nessie Curry, who was bursting with news. "Hamish," she exclaimed, "you'll never believe what I found." "What I found?" Jessie echoed behind her. "Well," Hamish prompted, inviting them in for tea despite his eagerness to hear the news. "I was tidying out the church hall yesterday," Nessie said, settling into his kitchen with evident satisfaction. "You know how Mrs. Stewart organises the Sunday school there?" "Organises there," Jessie confirmed. "Well, I found this wedge behind one of the storage cupboards." Nessie produced a folded piece of paper with a flourish. "It's a note, allegedly from Archie McLean to Julian Vane, threatening him." Hamish took the note and read it. The handwriting was crude, full of spelling errors, and the tone was unmistakably menacing. "Stay away from my shed or you'll regret it. This is your only warning." "Allegedly?" Hamish asked. "It's not Archie's handwriting," Nessie said firmly. "I've known that man for 40 years. He writes a beautiful copperplate, learned it at the old village school. This looks like someone trying to write badly on purpose." "On purpose," Jessie agreed. Hamish studied the note more carefully. Nessie was right. The mistakes were too deliberate, the threats too perfectly incriminating. and it had been found in the church hall where Moira worked. "When did you find this exactly?" Hamish asked. "Yesterday afternoon. I brought it straight to you, but you were out, so I'm bringing it now." Which meant Moira had planted it recently, probably hoping it would be discovered and used to further incriminate Archie. Insurance in case Blair started to doubt his case. But she'd made a mistake. She'd made several mistakes, actually. Small ones, barely noticeable individually. But together they formed a pattern. The fabricated timeline detail, the too convenient note, the coloured chalk on the murder weapon, the pieces of fabric at the scene, her intimate knowledge of the path, gained from childhood memories of the land her family once owned, and most damning of all, her motive. Revenge for her father's death, for her family's ruin, for years of hidden rage and patient waiting. Hamish sat at his kitchen table long after the Curry sisters had left, staring at the evidence spread before him. He had enough now to build a case, enough to convince even Blair that they were looking at the wrong suspect. But he wanted a confession. He wanted to hear Moira admit what she'd done and why. And for that he'd need to confront her directly. It was time to stop playing games and finish this investigation properly. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. Hamish chose his moment carefully. Sunday morning, when the village would be at church and Moira would be alone in her cottage, preparing lessons for the week ahead. He wanted privacy for this conversation, and he wanted Moira to feel secure enough to drop her carefully maintained facade. She answered his knock with her usual gentle smile, though Hamish thought he detected a flicker of wariness in her eyes. "Hamish, what a pleasant surprise! Do come in. I've just made coffee." "Thank you, Mrs. Stewart." He followed her into the neat parlour, noting the family photographs on the mantelpiece. A recent addition caught his eye. An old sepia print of a young couple with a child, Robert and Margaret Stewart with their daughter. Moira followed his gaze. "That's my parents," she said quietly. "I found the photograph recently while sorting through some old things. I thought it was time to have them out where I could see them." "They look happy," Hamish observed. They were, before everything fell apart. She poured coffee with steady hands. "You've worked it out, haven't you? That's why you're here." "Aye," Hamish said. "I have." Moira settled into her chair, the coffee cup balanced on her knee, and for a moment she looked very small and very tired. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I suspected after reading Vane's ledger. The entry about MS and the ancestral land was too specific to be coincidence. But I wasn't certain until I spoke with Angus MacDonald about your family's history." "Angus," Moira smiled faintly. "Of course. That old fraud knows everyone's secrets, doesn't he? Though I suppose they're not secrets anymore." "Why did you come back to Lockdoob?" Hamish asked. "Why not stay away, build a life somewhere else?" "Because this is my home," Moira said simply. "My family lived here for generations. We belonged here, and I couldn't bear the thought of letting the Vanes take that away from us as well as everything else." She set down her coffee and stood, moving to the window that looked out over the village. "I was 9 years old when my father killed himself," she said. "Old enough to understand what had happened, but not old enough to do anything about it. Gerald Vane destroyed my father with his lies and his greed. He took our land, our money, our future. And then he went back to London and lived a comfortable life while my mother worked herself to death trying to keep us fed." "But you came back," Hamish said. "Not immediately. I went to university, trained as a teacher, built a respectable life. I married briefly, but it didn't work out. Took my maiden name back." She turned to face him. "And then, about 5 years ago, I saw a position advertised for a teacher here in Lockdoob. It felt like fate. A chance to come home, to reclaim something of what we'd lost. And when Julian Vane appeared," Moira's expression hardened. "Pure coincidence initially. I had no idea Gerald Vane had a son, let alone that he'd end up here. But when he introduced himself, when I heard that name," she paused. "I did some research, found out that Julian was even worse than his father. A blackmailer, a bully, a man who enjoyed destroying people. So you decided to kill him." Not immediately, Moira said. At first I thought I could simply avoid him, wait for him to finish his consultation and leave, but then he started digging into the old property records. He found something I'd hoped would stay buried forever. The artefacts, Hamish said, remembering the ledger entry. My father, in the weeks before he died, hid several valuable items from our house to keep them from the creditors. Family heirlooms, things that had belonged to the Stuarts for generations. He buried them on the land near the old shepherd's path, planning to retrieve them once the bankruptcy was settled, but he never got the chance. And you knew where they were. My father told me the night before he died, made me promise not to tell anyone. Especially not my mother. He said it was my inheritance, all that I'd have left of the family. Moira's voice caught slightly. I've gone up there every year on his birthday, just to check that they're still safe. Julian Vane discovered this somehow, probably from old letters or diaries that ended up in the property files. He thought it was hilarious. He threatened to expose you. He mocked me, Moira said, and for the first time real anger coloured her tone. Called me a thief, said he'd tell the authorities, destroy my reputation as a teacher. Everything I'd built, everyone's trust in me, gone because of something my desperate father did 40 years ago. And he enjoyed it, Hamish. He truly enjoyed watching me squirm. She returned to her chair, her composure settling back into place like a mask. So I killed him, she said calmly. I asked him to meet me on the path that evening to discuss a compromise. He came, arrogant enough to think I'd actually pay him to keep quiet. I took the peat cutter from the library that afternoon, hid it near the stone marker. When he turned his back to look at the view, I struck him. Just once, Hamish said, remembering the autopsy report. I'd been practicing the angle, the force needed, used a similar implement on a turnip. She said it matter-of-factly, as if describing a lesson plan. One blow, precisely placed. He died quickly. I'd like to think it was merciful, though I doubt he deserved mercy. And then you planted evidence to implicate others. The boot prints were already there. Archie walks that path regularly. I simply drew attention to them. As for the rest, she shrugged. I thought if I appeared helpful, cooperative, no one would suspect the schoolteacher. Sweet, gentle Mrs. Stewart, always making tea and offering comfort. You underestimated Blair's incompetence, Hamish observed. Actually, I counted on it. I knew he'd arrest the first convenient suspect and declare the case solved. I never expected you to keep digging. Moira studied him with something like admiration. You're not at all what you pretend to be, are you, Hamish? The lazy constable who'd rather tend his sheep than do real police work. It's all an act. We all wear masks, Hamish said. Yes, Moira agreed. Though I wonder if mine has been on so long I've forgotten what's underneath. They sat in silence for a moment, the morning light streaming through the windows illuminating the gentle, respectable room where a murderer took her tea. What happens now? Moira asked finally. Now I arrest you, Hamish said, and you'll stand trial for murder. Will I? Moira's smile was sad. I killed a blackmailer and a bully, a man who would have destroyed me for his own amusement. Some might say that's justice. Some might, Hamish acknowledged. But it's not for you to decide. Or me. That's for a jury to determine. And if I don't confess officially, if I recant everything I've just told you, then I'll present the evidence. The chalk on the murder weapon that matches your classroom supplies. The fabric I found at the scene that I'm betting will match one of your dresses. The forged note you planted to implicate Archie. The timeline you created with a detail about a document that was destroyed decades ago. It's enough. Moira. More than enough. She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I suppose it is. And I'm tired, Hamish. So very tired of pretending. She set down her coffee cup with careful precision. I loved my father. He was a good man driven to desperation by a monster. And I've spent 30 years trying to be good too, trying to make up for what he did. But in the end, I became what I hated most. You became a killer, Hamish said. Yes, Moira said. I became a killer, just like Julian Vane's father was a killer in his own way. He killed my father as surely as if he'd tied the noose himself. Hamish stood. I need you to come with me now, Mrs. Stewart. We'll do this properly, with a formal statement and a lawyer present. Moira rose with quiet dignity. May I change into something more suitable? This dress is for Sundays. Not for police stations. Of course. I'll wait here. She left the room, and Hamish stood by the window looking out at the village he'd sworn to protect. Justice, he thought, was a complicated thing in the Highlands. The law said one thing, but the heart often said another. Still, he had his duty. And duty, in the end, was what separated civilization from chaos. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. Moira Stewart returned wearing a simple grey suit, her hair neatly pinned, looking every inch the respectable schoolteacher. She carried a small handbag and a coat, as if she were going to a parent-teacher conference rather than a police station to confess to murder. I'm ready, she said quietly. Hamish drove her to Strathbane in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The morning was bright and clear, the sort of day that mocked the darkness of their errand. When they arrived at the station, Hamish was unsurprised to find DCI Blair already there, presiding over the incident room with his usual bluster. Macbeth, Blair bellowed. What the devil are you doing here? And who's this? This is Mrs. Moira Stewart, Hamish said calmly. She's here to make a statement regarding the murder of Julian Vane. Blair's face went through several interesting colour changes. Statement? What kind of statement? A confession, Moira said, her voice steady. I killed Julian Vane. I'd like to speak with a lawyer, please, and then I'll tell you everything. The next few hours passed in a blur of official procedure. Moira was provided with a solicitor, a sharp woman from Inverness who looked distinctly uncomfortable with her client's willingness to confess. The formal interview was conducted with Blair in attendance, preening like a peacock who thought he'd orchestrated the entire thing. Moira repeated her story calmly and clearly, explaining her motive, her method, and her attempts to mislead the investigation. She showed no emotion beyond a certain weary resignation, as if she'd been carrying a heavy burden for so long that setting it down was almost a relief. When asked about the evidence, Hamish produced the chalk samples, the fabric scrap, the forged note, and his photographs of the ledger entries. He explained his reasoning step by step, building a case so thorough that even Blair couldn't find fault with it. Excellent work, Macbeth, Blair said magnanimously when the interview concluded, and Moira had been led away to the cells. Of course, I suspected her all along. Just needed you to gather the concrete evidence. Of course, sir, Hamish said, keeping his face carefully neutral. This'll make excellent headlines. Detective Chief Inspector Blair solves complex Highland murder. I can see it now. Blair rubbed his hands together with satisfaction. That incompetent fool, Archie McLean, can thank me for clearing his name. Hamish said nothing. There was no point in arguing with Blair's delusions. The important thing was that justice had been served, after a fashion. As he drove back to Lochdew, Hamish reflected on the case. Moira had killed a man who by all accounts deserved killing. But that didn't make it right, didn't make it legal. The law existed for a reason, and once you started making exceptions, where did you stop? Still, he couldn't help feeling a measure of sympathy for her. A child's tragedy had shaped an entire life, and in the end the cycle of revenge had claimed another victim. The village greeted the news of Moira's arrest with shock and disbelief. The Curry sisters declared it impossible, yet then remembered several suspicious incidents that proved they'd known all along. Angus MacDonald claimed his spirits had warned him, conveniently forgetting that he'd said nothing of the sort. Dr. Brodie shook his head sadly and muttered about the darkness that could hide in human hearts. Archie McLean, released from custody and reunited with his formidable wife, bought Hamish a drink at the hotel and declared him the finest policeman in Scotland. Though I'll never understand how you worked it out, Archie said, nursing his pint. She seemed such a nice woman. The nice ones are always the most dangerous, Hamish said. They're the ones nobody suspects. Jimmy Anderson appeared at the police station 2 days later with a bottle of whiskey and a rueful expression. Blair's taking all the credit, Jimmy said. air pouring generous measures into 2 glasses. Already given 3 interviews to the press about his brilliant detective work. Aye, well, that's Blair, Hamish said philosophically. Let him have his glory. It keeps him happy, and me in Loch Dubh. You're not bothered by it? Not in the slightest. In fact, I'm counting on it. Jimmy looked confused, then understanding dawned. The promotion. If Blair takes the credit, there's no reason to promote you. Exactly, Hamish said with satisfaction. I'm officially too lazy and incompetent to be anything more than a village constable, which suits me perfectly. You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth. So I've been told. They drank in companionable silence, watching the light fade over the loch. Outside, Lugs was chasing rabbits with more enthusiasm than skill, while Sonsi observed from the fence post with feline disdain. What'll happen to her? Jimmy asked. Mrs. Stewart, I mean. Trial, conviction, prison, Hamish said. Her confession and the evidence make it straightforward, though her lawyer might argue diminished responsibility given the circumstances. Will you testify? If I'm called, but I'll stick to the facts. The rest is for the jury to decide. Jimmy finished his whiskey and stood to leave. You did good work on this one, Hamish, even if Blair's taking the credit. That's kind of you to say. After Jimmy left, Hamish sat alone in his kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of his peaceful life. His sheep were fed, his animals content, his village safe. Tomorrow there would be other small crimes to solve, other minor dramas to navigate. But tonight he could rest. He thought about Moira Stewart sitting in a cell in Strathbane waiting for justice to take its course. She'd killed a man to avenge her father and protect her secrets, and in doing so she destroyed the life she'd built so carefully over the years. Revenge, Hamish reflected, always carried a price. The question was whether the satisfaction was worth the cost. He suspected in Moira's case the answer was no. The following week brought a formal commendation from headquarters, praising DCI Blair's exemplary work in solving a complex murder case. Hamish's name was mentioned in passing as having provided adequate local support. Hamish read the commendation, laughed, and filed it away with all the others. His record remained unblemished by excessive competence, his reputation as a lazy constable intact. The superintendent in Strathbane sent a memo suggesting that perhaps Hamish might benefit from additional training to improve his detective skills. Hamish filed that away too, with every intention of ignoring it. Life in Loch Dubh returned to its normal rhythm. A new teacher was hired for the school, a cheerful young woman from Inverness who knew nothing of the village's recent tragedy. The old shepherd's path remained open, the council having quietly shelved Vane's recommendations. The crofters returned to their traditional grazing routes, and nobody spoke of closing anything ever again. On a quiet evening a month after Moira's arrest, Hamish walked up to the old shepherd's path one last time. The stone marker stood as it had for centuries, unmoved by human drama. The view from there was spectacular, the Sutherland Peak stretching away into the distance, the loch gleaming below. He thought about the Stewarts, about the land they'd lost and the tragedy that had followed. Somewhere near here, buried in the peat, were the family heirlooms that Robert Stewart had hidden to protect his daughter's inheritance. Moira had never revealed their exact location, and Hamish had no intention of searching for them. Some things were better left buried. He walked back down to the village as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Lugs bounded ahead, disturbing a grouse that exploded from the heather with indignant squawks. Sonsi padded silently at Hamish's heels, her wild eyes watchful. At the police station, Hamish fed his animals, made himself a cup of tea, and settled into his favourite chair with a piece of shortbread. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of heather and peat in the eternal Highland rain. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight, Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he wanted to do, which was, when you came down to it, absolutely nothing. And that, Hamish thought contentedly as Lugs snored at his feet and Sonsi curled into a purring ball on the sofa, was exactly how he liked it.